We have great experts on a really, really exciting reform trend that's sweeping the country right now, and it's called course access. And what it gets at is about a student's opportunity to learn. Right now, too often depends on where he or she goes to school. And we've heard a lot about that in terms of a thematic issue as part of this conference, particularly as it relates to school choice, but it really gets down to also course access as well. The courses that you as a student have available to you often is limited based on what is offered at a school. And increasingly, there are states that are passing some legislation and some policy, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, that gives students the right to take a certain number of courses from other authorized providers. The state authorizing a really diverse group of providers, sometimes online, a lot of blended learning solutions, sometimes face-to-face solutions, that a student can select. And so this helps open up options for students in a whole bunch of different ways. Students that don't have access to foreign language courses, to advanced math or science courses, or they don't have access to teachers that just relate to them, right? And I think this is one of the ways like course access is really connecting with lawmakers and also with the public, because we can all relate to going to a school that we really kind of clicked with, but there was one teacher, right? May not have been a bad teacher, just as a teacher that we didn't click with. That, for me, that was my math teacher. And I didn't have much of the option. If you didn't click with your math teacher, there was no other math teacher in that school. But course access gives those students another opportunity. Maybe they're going to learn better through Khan Academy. Maybe they're going to learn better through Connections or through Florida Virtual School. So this gives them the opportunity on a course-by-course basis to help really personalize and customize their education. And again, sometimes online learning, a lot of blended learning, and sometimes face-to-face. Students still attend their local schools, and so they continue to learn from their school's teachers. They have lunch with their friends. They join in extracurricular activities, but they have a whole new world of learning opportunities to follow their passions and explore their learning. This reform is building momentum across the country, including in states like we'll learn from today, from Louisiana, as well as Texas, Michigan, and Minnesota. It's also receiving a lot of support, a lot of attention, and a lot of thought leadership from partners, from the Clay Christensen Institute, which we're here for Michael Horn, but I just want to acknowledge some of our other partners in the audience. INACOL, Maria is here, so raise your hand. Ed Council, Terry, is a huge partner for us. Lefty is both a partner as well as the leader of course access down in Louisiana. Did I miss anything? We also have AFC, the Fordham Institute. There's just a number of other partners that are sort of helping us on this. So this has been a team and collaborative effort. The panel today is a chance for you to hear from some of the experts in states that are implementing these policies, what were the lessons learned from the legislative battles, as well as the implementation battles. We're finding that that's one of the key challenges in this reform. And then also from Michael, who's just such a leading scholar and thought leader on online learning and blended learning generally, but has been just instrumental in helping to shape and conceptualize and put this reform in its place across the country. So I'll just quickly introduce our panel, then we'll jump right in to some questions. But to my left, we have Michael Horn, who's the co-founder of the Clay Christensen Institute. We have Jamey Fitzpatrick, who's the CEO of the Michigan Virtual University. Julie Lynn, who's the executive director for Texans for Education Reform, and up to about, was it a year ago, in the governor's office? So she's had some governor's office experience as well. And then Deborah Proctor, to my immediate left, from the Minnesota Department of Education. So Michael, I thought I'd start with you. Could you just give us a quick overview, like just from your perspective and as someone who's been studying online learning and blended learning, just how have you seen course access evolve just conceptually over the last couple of years, and why do you think it's been so attractive to policymakers and to education reformers?
Sure thing, John. So my sense actually is that a lot of the ideas from course access stemmed from two things that were going on in the broader world of education and online learning, dating back to basically in Florida, and I see Julie Young there and some of the Florida Virtual School team, the decision of the legislature there in 2003, I believe, to switch to a per pupil funding model that allowed dollars to follow students down to the course level and give students access to basically a menu of courses that they might not have at their traditional school, which allowed Florida Virtual School to increase enrollment quite a bit. As you started to see many, many more providers entering the online learning space beyond the state virtual schools, policymakers started to ask the question, how can we give students access to even a broader range of choice choices so that they can find modalities or teachers or experiences that would meet their needs. And a lot of the momentum, I think, for what we now think of as course access, which is not just access to one provider, but a multiplicity of approved providers by the State Office of Education, from online learning to blended learning to a lot of vocational and technical education programs, I think got its momentum from those early days. And people started to see, if you were in a rural district in a lot of these states, you just didn't have access to any advanced courses often, period. It was extraordinarily stark, your options. So actually go back to 2007, 26% of high school students nationwide had no access to any advanced course, defined as anything above biology, so no chemistry, no physics, defined as anything above geometry, so no algebra 2, forget about calculus, and defined as any honors English class, period. And so you think about the choices and opportunities accessible to those children in the absence of a policy like this. It was difficult, and while districts were always free to contract with private providers, the ability to do so was strained, quite frankly, the resources of both the smaller and smaller a district got. And so having a statewide policy really opened up. One last thing, John, which was, I think a lot of people looked at the Florida model and saw, for better or for worse as it evolved, a performance funding-based component of it, and got really excited about, gee, we could not just shift this from an access conversation, but to a real quality where we're going to actually start paying providers for success in a way that we can't with traditional brick and mortar schools. And what would that mean to a real shift to personalized and student-centered learning and teaching us what the accountability system of the future really should look like? And I think that's motivated a lot of policymakers as well around the country.
Jamey, talk to us a little bit about, one of the shifts is that, back in the 90s, the focus from a lot of state policy was on how to sort of build courses. Invest money, they would be building courses. Now with course access, it's approving a portfolio of different providers. But how do you go about doing that in your state in that sort of process? And what is it that you look for? What's the process that you go through?
So Michigan, I think, has taken a somewhat different approach. We don't have a centralized approval process in our state. The legislation that was enacted a little over a year ago provides an opportunity literally for every school district in the state of Michigan to make a decision as to whether or not they want to be not only a course consumer of somebody else's online courses, but also a course provider. So there's not a single organization that's kind of making the approval process with regards to, this course is in and this course is out. As part of that process, when a school district makes a decision to put something in the statewide catalog, and we've had the legislation now for a little over a year, we have 1,500, 1,600 course titles in the statewide catalog, and almost 50 organizations have put titles into that catalog. But as part of that process of putting a course title into the catalog, there's a syllabus that you have to publish and identify all the prerequisites and the learning elements that are covered in the course, but also publish the results of a quality review. So that provides some transparency to the consumer, the student and the mom and dad that are looking to potentially enroll in that online course. And then going forward, the statewide catalog will also have all the completion data associated with a particular course title. So really the policy framework there was to try to build a market where literally every school district in the state could get into providing online courses outside of their normal geographic service area.
Julie, talk a little bit about just in Texas, because you had a virtual school network in the state, and then about 2 years ago, I guess, legislation was passed. But tell us a little bit about what led to that legislation and how is that enacting more of this portfolio approach?
Sure, and my voice on the panel today is that of the impact and need for a third-party advocacy organization, oftentimes to really help push innovation forward in politics and the legislative process. So Texas started tinkering with online learning in 2001, 2003, and that was at the beginning of my career in the Texas legislature, and passed some pilot programs to start dabbling in online learning. By 2007, passed legislation enabling the Texas Virtual School Network. I had moved away from the state for 10 years, and I had actually worked for one of the largest online education providers during that time, both nationally and internationally. And when I returned for the 2013 session, I was pretty shocked that at that time, TR is a very research-based organization and looking at student-centric policies. And as TR created their legislative agenda, they found what I found upon returning, which is Texas, which was initially positioned in early 2000s to be a leader in online learning, was now looking to other states. We hadn't pushed forward. We had a highly regulated Texas Virtual School Network program. We have some prohibitions in both part-time and full-time online learning, and a really small course catalog, and that has to do with some of the regulations. So TR helped push that that broadening Texas Virtual School Network legislation forward. It wasn't easy, and I'm happy to talk about some of the legislative challenges for those in the room who want to do this in their own state and how you bring people together. But the four highlights are, first and foremost, you have to have research-based student-centric policies. Secondly, you need the right legislative champions. Third, you need other advocacy organizations to come and help you in the advocacy part and in the implementation part. Fourth, you need a real focus on implementation. So after we passed the bill, which was a challenge, and many things in the bill were watered down, that we're going to come back again in 2015 and try to take down some of those barriers. But we had a roundtable in the Commissioner of Education's office where we brought in top national experts. Heather Staker was there from the Christensen Institute. Susan Patrick from INACOL was there. Terry Lefty was there from Louisiana. John was there from Digital Learning Now. So it was just such a rich resource for TEA. TEA has limited resources, and we wanted to make sure that the implementation was right, and I think that they did a good job on some of that implementation. So those four things were really important to the process. And then I think every state needs to continue to advocate for pushing forward on innovation every legislative session, because it's going to continue to change. And so we'll do that in 2015 as well.
Before moving to Deborah, talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned from the advocacy. So just because, I mean, you were very active in helping to coordinate a lot of us and helping to tell us when was the right time to come in with what sort of advocacy support, but just what were some of the lessons learned that as other states are trying to consider this and pass this, that could help them accelerate those efforts?
Sure. So during the legislative process, we had folks like Heather Staker and John, I know Digital Learning Now was there testifying with us. So in that advocacy stage of the process, we really had to focus on it being research-based and it not being, the opposition talks so much about corporatizing public education. And we really had to look first at who's the right legislative sponsor. So Representative Ken King in Texas was on the House Public Education Committee. Representative Joe Deschantel is here as well and supported the legislation. But Ken King came, a former school board member from the tip of the Texas Panhandle, so really rural area. Having him as a legislative sponsor was really important in the advocacy because he could say, first of all, I am the furthest advocate that you can find from what the opposition termed virtual vouchers in the state. So they created a lot of fear among legislators and staffers that this was just a backdoor for virtual vouchers in Texas. And so having the right legislative sponsor in the House and in the Senate, Senator Hagar sponsored the bill, and he also had some rural areas, and we focused on an equity argument. So research-based policy focused on equity and opportunity for students was really helpful, and then bringing some of our third-party friends along. And there's always an interesting balance in the legislative process, and Mickey knows this very well. I used to work with her in my former role in working in states, balancing the equity argument and course access for students, and making sure that it doesn't get too caught up in the vendor argument, that there are education organizations, whether nonprofit or for-profit, that are going to make money off of these courses. It's a reality in the same way that textbook companies make money off of textbooks. And so you really have to balance that argument, but keep it focused on student course access, because at the end of the day, that's the most important. And then implementation, once it went to the agency, there was one significant barrier in the bill, which was we had to compromise on language that said if a district offers a substantially similar course, the district could deny the student enrollment in that course. And we're coming back, and there's just no, I don't think, a rational argument for it if you're truly thinking about what's best for students. And so, but we were able, through national thought partners and research, to show that, first of all, there was a way through interpretation that we could overcome that. And I think the agency did a really great job in interpreting substantially similar to actually mean not substantially similar as in I have an Algebra 1 math teacher in high school, but substantially similar, they defined it as an online course in that same subject. And so, and that was through working with other states and learning from Louisiana and Utah and Florida about how they implemented it.
Yeah, just two lessons to draw upon there. One is the use of partners. Part of the reason I wanted to highlight some of the partners that aren't on stage, and we have others too with Robin and from Utah, that it's use these folks to bring in the right mix of people to be the right advocates, right? It's you have folks from different political persuasions that can help. We did a white paper with Ed Council, and the foreword on course access was done by former Governor and Secretary of Education Dick Riley and Governor Bush to help show the bipartisan nature of this. But then you also have, the Switzerland of the political space with Michael Horn, and then really technical thought leaders like Nagel. And so, use us in different ways. And second, this issue, it does come down to these legislative fights to a lot of issues about the funding, and there's a huge focus on the for-profit providers, but a huge missed opportunity in terms of how many districts have a Sal Khan stuck in there just waiting to have access to being able to offer their own courses. This could be revenue generator for individual teachers and for schools themselves. But let's talk a little bit. So we've passed the policy, the State Department's implemented the policy, but what happens if you have a party and no one shows up? So how do you, so talk to us a little bit about how do you let parents know, how do you let schools know about these opportunities and get kids to participate?
Certainly. And I'd like to say, too, that when I'm here, I'm representing the Minnesota Department of Education as its online and digital learning specialist. And in that role, my role is one of support and one to make sure that the legislative language is adhered to and that it works, and that the public entities in our state who want to become providers are given a pathway to do that, and then also that it takes place in the time constraints that are outlined there. So for us, what we do to communicate the information is, of course, we put it on our website, and you can find all of the information about Minnesota online learning at education.state.mn.us. And you can do a search that says online, and it's going to pull up a lot of things. And that's the main way that we communicate with our students and our parents. And so there's a lot of information out there for students and parents, and for the districts themselves, not only the approved online providers that are public entities, but those schools who are interested in becoming a provider, or those schools who, are interested in not maybe letting their students take an online course. That's part of it too. So part of it is also helping them understand the legislation, and that in our state, it's an enrollment choice. Students can take an online course, and there is no barrier that can be put in front of them. We have both comprehensive and supplemental programs.
Jamey, you've developed some resources to help engage parents on this that are pretty cutting, but talk a little bit about that. What led you to develop it? How do you get it in the hands of the parents?
Yeah, I would just suggest to the policy leaders that are here that passing the legislation is one element of this, but making people aware of the policy is probably as big or even a larger challenge. Michigan has had in place dual enrollment legislation for 20 years, which allows kids at the high school level to take, college level courses, and the district pays those tuition fees. We still have districts that, even though they're required by law to share that knowledge and information and create the awareness with parents, do very little to promote those opportunities. So we didn't want this policy framework to take 20 years to kind of get institutionalized. So we tried to take away every perceived barrier to implementation away by creating a set of resources. So we created an implementation guide. We created sample policies that school boards could look. Most school districts haven't adopted local policies, so we drafted some sample policies that they could look at and modify. Somebody's going to have to communicate to parents that this choice option is here. So we wrote sample letters that schools could send out to their families. And we created this set of resources. We've also been active in doing radio interviews and using social media. We partnered with our State Department of Ed and the Michigan Association of Broadcasters to implement a PSA campaign. So we've got radio ads, TV ads in movie theaters, on billboards, because most people still don't know that this law is in place and the kids have options to take up to 2 online courses any given term. As part of that, trying to move the needle on awareness, we just did our first statewide public opinion survey. We surveyed 800 adults in Michigan, and what we found is that almost 8 in 10 adults in Michigan are supportive of kids having access to online courses at grades 6 through 12. But what they know about the policy is really, really diminished, and so we're kind of rolling a rock up a hill, but we're trying to do everything we can to create awareness, because you can have the greatest policy in the world, and if kids and parents don't know about it, it's not going to get used. It's kind of like, those of us that have employee status, we don't know about the company benefits, like, there's tuition reimbursement or dental insurance. If you don't know about it, you're not going to use it.
There's tuition reimbursement? Maybe, Michael, just building on this, because I do think this is one of the things we've been learning as a community, that, again, it's not just getting the legislation right and the state implementation, but it's like reaching out and reaching parents and helping them. But what's impressed you? Because I know every state's approached this differently. Some states have just thrown up a PDF of the approved providers. Other states have done a more interactive website. But what's impressed you as you and Heather have looked at states and the type of catalogs that they've produced?
Yeah, so I think you're seeing a lot of forward thinking on this. Louisiana did some good work on this early on that I think moved the needle quite substantially on people's idea of what a portal could look like that would not just show you the options, but then also show you how people felt about those options, what the results were from those options, to really inform students and educators, quite frankly, around that. I think a lot of the work that Jamey just referenced is really impressive too, getting actually out into the airwaves and where people are communicating to learn about these choices. And then I'd say a third one that I think we discount a little bit, but is actual outreach to the districts themselves. Because, and I think Robin can tell you this, Utah was the first state to put in place what we would call a course access bill 2011. Some of the biggest opposition initially was from school districts. And so I think really communicating to school districts why this actually is a positive for them is a really important component of this. And if you don't mind, John, just focus on a few elements. Because the initial reaction, right, is that this is driving dollars away from school district budgets. And I think there's a tendency from people or from legislators to demonize that. But realistically, none of us like dollars being taken away from us, so I don't think we should blame them on that, but instead thinking about how does this enhance them. And so I look at 5 things. One, it allows them to offer courses that they couldn't offer, which should give them an unlimited course catalog, in essence, that they can reach any student with. And they all struggle with these limitations just from budget realities. The second part of it is it breaks the need for them to negotiate with lots and lots of private providers and reinvent the wheel lots of times on contract language that, quite frankly, is difficult for a district to do well. Instead, the state has sort of taken that role, or through a variety of mechanisms has created that portal of options that they can help students draw from. The third one, and Lefty and I have talked a lot about this, is in theory it should allow districts to become much more strategic about what they offer. And so if you have a terrific arts program, you can really double down on that and use these online courses to create great blended learning options. In a lot of places, you might not have great assets. It does presuppose a certain amount of budgeting flexibility and capacity that districts haven't historically had, and I think that's one of the really important things from the broader regulatory framework, freeing up the way dollars can be spent that follows students into these districts is really important so they can make these strategic choices. The fourth one is, I think it gives districts the cover to innovate themselves in their communities, and we saw this in Utah. Innovations Early College High School popped up as a result in many ways from this law because districts wanted to keep students, so they started to create blended learning schools themselves. And then lastly, my sense, and this is a broader thing, which is that we're going into a world right now, not just in K-12, but especially in higher education and lifelong learning, where students have just an unbelievable array of unbundled options from lots and lots of different sources, and it's quite frankly confusing. Like the number of choices that I will make for my kids compared to the number of choices that I had growing up, it's just like crazy magnified. And so I think an opportunity for the district to step in there as the arbiter of coherence and really help each student create that individualized pathway is a really important opportunity that needs to be done regardless of policy, and this maybe is the impetus to get there.
In some ways, guidance counselors are becoming more important.
Yes.
And this. But let's not stray too far from this topic, but just quickly, Jamey, Julie, Deborah, how else are you reaching out to districts to help secure this buy-in and help address some of the concerns? Because that does seem to be coming up in implementations. How do you get the buy-in?
I think it's fair that this is a policy in Michigan that very few K-12 school leaders and district leaders want it for a whole variety of reasons. I think for most it felt like another way that they were going to lose money or the kids that represent the money. And one of the things that we've tried to do messaging on is, Michigan has some urban population centers, but we're also a very rural state. If you look at our Upper Peninsula, it represents a third of the state's land mass and 3% of the state's population. But those small school districts that maybe have a rock star teacher who teaches astronomy, and every semester they struggle to have 8 kids in the class or 9 kids in the class, we now are having some discussions with school leaders who are saying, you know what, I really want to keep that teacher teaching astronomy in my district. And 30 years ago, my only option if that went away was to just displace that educator. Now I can think about taking that rock star teacher, converting that course to an online course, putting it in the statewide catalog and advertising it, and maybe I can get 20 kids from around the state to enroll in that course and it becomes sustainable. So it's trying to get them to think outside the box and not just look at this as they're gonna lose. I think Michael made reference to it. It's trying to create a market and help spur on some of that entrepreneurial mindset that we typically don't see a lot of in the K-12 space as it relates to student populations served.
In Texas, we saw actually a huge decrease in enrollments in part-time online learning. So in 2010-11, there were 23,000 online course enrollments through Texas Virtual School Network. The state had to cut back funding in the 2011 legislative session, and the virtual school allotment was cut, which was essentially districts that allowed a student to enroll in an online course received $80 extra for that student, so it's a little bit of incentive. That was taken away, and in 2014, there were 2,300 students in Texas enrolled in online courses. So what we believed is that we actually needed to, we realized that districts weren't making information available to families about course access and the option. And so we actually mandated in law that districts have to provide annual notification to parents about a student's right to enroll. So we've actually come at it from a mandate perspective. But I think over time that will grow. And the argument is just very strong that in Texas, there 23% of our districts, students in 23% of our districts don't have access to AP courses. So as we start talking about this as a state, and Senator Kelseliger is here, is on the Senate Education Committee, support our legislation. He lives in Amarillo and represents a lot of the Panhandle in West Texas. And in his districts, they know that to offer AP courses and foreign language courses and IB, that they need online options. So hopefully that will grow over time. So we took a mandate approach.
One of the interesting things that's happened in Minnesota over the last couple of years are the kinds of different questions that are being asked from the public school providers and their reactions to the students enrolling in supplemental courses. Over the last couple of years, I've had a number of large school districts come forward, and they've decided that they want to make online learning a part of their offering, just as they have an alternative learning program or whatever. They want to have online learning. And one of the rationales for that they put in when they go through the approval process is they actually will list, we were looking at the number of dollars that were leaving our school to go to a supplemental program. And we decided if this is what parents and students want, then we need to figure out a way how we're going to integrate that in to our school districts. So we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe 5 school districts do that over the last couple of years. And for me, that's exciting. And so if you go to look at Anoka Hennepin School District, do a pull-down menu. It'll list all their schools, their high schools, their elementary schools, and then it'll say, step ahead, online learning. If you go to look at the Duluth Public Schools, it'll list all of their schools, and then it'll say, advanced, I think their name is Academic Excellence, and you'll see that. So schools are starting to think about online learning and how does it fit in to what we need to do to serve our students and to keep our students. Also have had questions from principals and superintendents who need to deliver a course but don't have a teacher who's licensed to teach that course. And so they're trying to figure out what kinds of things they can do. And oftentimes they don't know that there's a clearinghouse and a list of AP courses and other online courses that they could use and just have a few students in and then still serve their students, keep them connected to their school, but deliver what it is to the student to make them stay into school. So it's been interesting in that perspective because I'm getting different questions rather than, how can I keep this student from losing this student? How can I keep them from losing, but rather how can I keep that student in? And I talk with superintendents too about the revolving door. Not every student is suited to online learning, and some will go into online learning and love it and they'll stay there and they'll do more. Others will fail miserably, but if you haven't done a good job in keeping the relationship with that student and the parent that's going to leave to take those courses, it's not going to be easy for them to come back in and to be a part of your school again.
And John, I'd also like to say, so Michael outlined his sort of 5 arguments for why districts should want to be engaged in offering these course access options, and he actually has a great concise publication on that we did share with districts. So what's the name of it? It came out.
I'm trying to remember. 5 reasons I think why districts should love
5 reasons why districts should love course access. So it's a good it's a good publication to share. He's got some great arguments there. So we shared that with districts and superintendents. But I'll stress again, I think oftentimes as advocacy organizations, you need to go direct to parents because there's always going to be a natural districts are naturally in some ways disincentivized from offering those options. And so in Texas, we actually, and John, I think you were involved in some of these conversations, we had a conversation about how can we create more public awareness about this, and we were hoping that there might be a nonprofit that would help with some public awareness, PSAs, billboards. TEA just launched a new website for TXVSN, and we wanted to get that message out. I would have loved for my organization to do it, but it's not what my organization is set up to do. And so I don't know if there are other states where that's an option, but we've been talking to Lisa Duty at the Learning Accelerator, and so maybe looking for some partnerships to be able to do that at the state level.
Yeah, what struck me listening to is that it's probably not going to be one approach, but like a combination of both mandates for parent notification. I mean, Jamey's doing some really cutting edge, marketing and advertising, which is a new area for us in public policy, right? We don't sort of think about sort of a line item in the authorizing legislation to sort of help promote, but it's so key because otherwise you starve an agency of resources and then they get the catalog up, the approval's done, but there's no sort of parent outreach. And then it also sounds like, too, the importance of highlighting early district success, right? Districts that have thought of an innovative way. The first time a district can offer every single AP course to all of their students, that's a win that needs to be kind of highlighted. Let's talk real quick for anyone on the panel that wants to talk about your approach. But I mean, obviously, and I bet this is a question for a lot of folks in the audience, but we get this all the time about quality, right? That it's so easy for us to hold up the really great examples of the high quality online or blended learning providers that are doing great things for kids, but then there's that one bad apple. Or there's several bad apples. So how do you ensure high quality in a way that really does value outputs in terms of student outcomes and not just sort of inputs in sense of a lot of forms and paper that a provider filled out? But what's the best approach or the approaches that you're seeing in your states for anyone? Or Michael can offer the God view from around the country.
Go ahead.
All right, so I guess my sense is that there's twofold way that we've thought about it, I think, as a group. And one is on the front end, right, having really robust authorizing procedures, not just for the providers, but also for the courses themselves, to make sure that they're matching up with standards, that they're reasonable quality on the front end, that adhere to the standards we know are important for high quality. INACOL has their online quality standards, so matching to that and state standards is a great place to start. My sense is that's certainly not enough, because that's sort of like a baseline, and then you want to see what's actually coming out the other side. And so we're starting to see movement toward funding policies that actually will pay the provider a partial amount up front for serving, because there is a real cost to serving students, but will withhold some of that payment for successful completion. And ideally, that would be tied to some sort of objective assessment outside. Now, that presents some questions for states, and I think there's a lot of creativity here to be done with auditing and using different assessment mechanisms that don't require you to have a state test for every single subject that is possible, which is just not going to happen. I think there's a lot of room for sampling and auditing creativity here to do these sorts of things, and Florida has done a pretty good job of having some assessments that are offered at a couple times each year that sort of move the needle forward. But the more and more I think we can get to those actual outcome-based funding, that's going to be the real metric out there, because you're only paying for results. And I'll just put in one other plug. New Hampshire, which doesn't get a lot of attention in this conversation, but has moved very forward on aggressively on competency-based learning. What their virtual learning academy charter school does is that they take funding as students master the course. So they've replaced the ADA completely, average daily attendance. And so if a student makes 10% progress and masters 10% of the material, then they get 10% funding. When they do the next 10%, they'll take down 10 more percent. So it takes away a lot of debates that states have had over 50% up front, 50% on the back end, or is it 40 and 60? Like, what's the right amount? This just says, hey, there's a cost to serve as you go, and as you prove mastery, you get paid for it. So progress is the new ADA, if you will.
In Texas, we have course completion funding 70% upfront and 30% upon completion, which I think creates really good incentives. We also, course providers the courses have to be aligned to our Texas standards and to INACOL standards. So that's some of the ways that we're ensuring quality. And my organization is really interested in student outcomes and student achievement. So we're discussing, including in our legislation this session, what do you do with poor performing course providers? If we're looking at student results and if we're interested in student achievement, what do you do on that end? So that's something we'll be contemplating through the legislative session. We only want the high quality providers in our space.
Sure.
Minnesota is course completion as well. But when I arrived at the department 3 years ago, there had been an Office of Audit from the legislature. And what they had wanted us to do is to really improve process, both the approval process and the reapproval process. So much of our work over the last 3 years has been directed towards those two things. So there's a rigorous approval process where providers come through and they must make assurances to the department of their ability to do this. And in fact, in many ways, when they go through the approval process, they've written a business plan. They better understand what it is they're taking on and what it is that they need to do to be a provider. After they become a provider and they're put on that list, there's a 3-year period and they are reapproved. So in that reapproval process, what we've done is we use INACOL program standards for online learning, and the providers undergo a self-study where they actually will look at those standards and they will look at their practices and they will align documents and evidence and their courses and everything in a portfolio, and then that's submitted to the department. And we have a couple of reviewers come in and look at those and make a recommendation about whether or not the agency should be reapproved. We've done that just once so far in 2013, and there were 13 providers that went through that reapproval process. And for some of them, that's the first time that they've really had any kind of a check back or an oversight visit or a conversation with the department since they were approved. And some of them were approved as far back as 1999. So because of that process, we know more now about those 13 providers internally than we ever have before. This year, there are 6 providers who are going through that, and that will be wrapped up, I'm hoping, by December. The report on that first 3-year approval process is out on the internet. But I'm going to just read one quote from a superintendent who had an opportunity to read and review that. And he's a superintendent at Rush City School District, and he said that it's important for all the schools, the public schools in our state, to know that online learning providers systematically compare their course content with state and national standards. So for that superintendent, just knowing that the online providers in our state go through that process is a quality assurance for that provider. Thank you.
Jamie?
We've got a 3-part process. One, to put a course into the statewide catalog, you have to publish the results of a quality review using the INACOL standards. 2, we have a 80-20 payment process, 80% on enrollment, 20% on completion. And then the third element is the reporting on completion rate, so everybody in the state can see what a particular course. I do think we're probably, collectively, we need to think about, Michael could have an online course and have a 99% completion rate. I could have an online course with a 50% completion rate, but maybe mine's too hard and his is too easy. And looking at some independent assessments at end of course seems like it may be one of the ways, independent of an audit process, where we can create some apples to apples comparison. I think independent of that, it's going to be really hard to compare one provider against another provider.
Yeah. So let me just quickly amplify the audit idea, which is the thought would be rather than testing every single student who goes through the program, you would do what NAEP does in effect, right? NAEP in all your states for its assessments results only tests a few thousand students in a state to get a sample of how the state is performing and uses that to chart the state's performance. And so basically you would say, providers, you use the performance assessment you want, but we're gonna come in every once in a while with some sort of assessment instrument. It might be a performance-based assessment, it might be an objective assessment, and we're gonna make sure that the correlation is in a certain line so that we say that the results you're actually reporting are ones we actually trust. You're not just passing through students to get the dollars themselves. Sorry, 3 other quick points that I just thought were worth highlighting from what you all said, which was timeliness of the reviews on the front end. So the problem in Texas before this law had been that these timelines for review would take forever. And so having very clear, 6 months or something reasonable for these reviews are really important. Transparency just came out very big. So having a place where you can actually see these results and allow students, counselors, parents to make more informed choices. And then the third thing I'd say, you're going to hear the argument when you put these measures in place from certain online providers. They're going to come to you and say, we would love to be signed up for a higher bar once the school districts themselves or once the traditional brick and mortar themselves will do it too. Step up. And that should be your message, like step up. We're putting a higher bar in here from the get-go. We'll have that conversation when we can show good results in math and that there's a lot of students here, but step up for students and let's set a higher bar in this field because we don't want to be playing that game. We know what that game looks like.
Yeah, I was just building on a couple of the comments here, and Michael's last one, I mean, just as you're considering policy, be unapologetic for setting a high bar and for quality. The pay for performance, the pay for success sort of system that a couple of the states are doing, whether it's completion or even better for student outcomes, that's more accountable than a lot of the way that we fund traditional public schools. But also the other thing I hope you take away is like one theme too, is that quality is not an event, but an ongoing process, right? And this is, I think, lessons learned from other areas where we've had to approve providers is that, it's a really rigorous amount of paperwork for a rigorous amount of time, and then an event. You're approved, and then their approval's granted for years. And this, even after some of these approvals, you still have to pay for completion, pay for success. There's, interim periods, the audits and whatnot. So huge commitment to that. And just, again, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the lowest, your lowest performing ones that are going to get the news headlines and define the whole program. And I think we've seen Lefty in Louisiana. They've said it was easier to get into Harvard than it was to get into Lefty's program. But you started off with what I think it was like 92 providers and four-step process. And what did you end up with?
45 the first year, of which 21 were active. Because we separated out. You got approved as a course provider, but that didn't mean you were going to be allowed to offer courses. That was yet another negotiation. And quite frankly, depending on the caliber of the provider, we gave them more or fewer opportunities.
Yeah.
So we had 4 steps and then the final negotiation.
And then lastly, the other thing that we're trying to look at is that, if you've gone through the Harvard process with Lefty, how do we get that to be recognized by other states? And that's something for you all to think about too, that if you've set up a rigorous process, but how do you recognize a provider that's gone through a rigorous process in another state? And it doesn't have to be automatic approval, but it could be fast track approval. We do that in trade, we can do that here as well. Let's bring you into this conversation with your questions, comments, concerns. We have 2 mics. And we're being live streamed and also videotaped. And so feel free to take a mic and ask your question, and we'll see if we can help answer it. Oh, Giselle. We'll go with Mickey.
Mickey beat you, Giselle. That was huge.
Giselle always gets the first question.
I guess that I attended a session about communications. And one of the things that a person from Tennessee mentioned was that they send things home with report cards. Now, it seems to me that if the state passes a law that is supposed to apply to all the schools in the state, it has the right to send home with the kids or to demand that that be done. Is that something that people do?
I can tell you that in Michigan, we have school districts that are required to report to families and students that we call it 21F is the name of the legislation in Michigan, the course access program. It ends up being in the student handbook in 3-point font on page 48. And they've legally met their obligation, but they haven't done anything to really get the word out. So they can check it off as having done it, but not done it well.
And it can't be mandated?
It is mandated.
No, I mean, to specify
Yeah.
how it is.
We haven't figured out how to mandate it in terms of quality.
It was mandated in Louisiana, they just didn't do it.
They just didn't do it.
Deborah?
Yes, I was going to say that in Minnesota, every school district is required to have online learning liaison, someone that understands it. And it can be assigned to any person. Sometimes it's the superintendent, sometimes it's the principal, sometimes it's the guidance counselor, sometimes it's the administrative assistant that sits in the office. And then once people learn what that is and how to do it, and what their responsibilities are, there's a lot of movement. So if they take another job, that's lost. And typically, parents in our state, if they're looking for online learning, they're not going to come to the Minnesota Department of Education's webpage. They're going to Google, and when they Google, everything, I don't know how many pages down you'd have to go before you got to the Department of Education. I should check that when I get back. But, and our schools don't advertise. I think there are only 2 of our approved providers who advertise, and I hear their advertisements. I see them on TV, and I hear them on the radio, and that's because those 2 schools are associated with for-profit entities who market and do things. So most Minnesota residents would assume that there are only 2 approved online schools in our state because they don't have a way to find out about all of the opportunities that are available to them.
It's a great idea, though. Sounds like it's a good idea, but not sufficient to help, but something probably to incorporate in law. Question?
Yes, Travis Pillow, Step Up for Students. We've got in Florida, I believe we just opened up the first round of applications for our course access providers, and I think it's interesting to try to think about who might apply. If you look at the course catalogs in some other places, you see like entities like Associated Builders and Contractors doing like career type courses. These kind of entities that you don't maybe think of as educational providers. Like there's a huge shortage of physics teachers and calculus teachers in a lot of places. Maybe there's like a retired engineer or someone or a grad student somewhere who could sort of help fill those gaps and provide courses through this platform. And so I'm wondering, like, to what extent does this allow you to sort of redefine who a teacher even is, or who a provider of courses even is?
Thoughts, anyone?
Well, so on the provider of courses, I think Louisiana is the great model of that, which is that a lot of the early instantiations of this were only focused on a pretty narrow definition of online provider. And what you see in Louisiana is lots of community colleges, technical education programs, others getting in to offer a pretty wide range of modality for students to get in that are not just a distance version of online, not just a blended version of online, but often just like hands dirty, getting in there. And what's advantageous about that is it won't work for every student, obviously, because of geography. But a lot of students in districts won't necessarily sign those agreements with community colleges in the absence of some sort of a precedent like that. So on the provider, yes. On the teacher, I don't think it waives any of those requirements, but.
Yeah. Michigan hasn't tie-barred any of the choice to the teacher licensure issue. So in fact, the definition of an online course is it has to be a teacher with a Michigan certificate.
And that's the same for Minnesota as well, licensed Minnesota teacher. And then the other thing is that in our state, a provider is a public school district, a charter school, a cooperative, and those kinds of things. It's not an outside corporation or a vendor.
In Texas, you also have to have that Texas teacher license. And what we did in House Bill 1926 last session was opened up the way that different course providers could come into our state. So prior to the passage of that bill, you actually had to partner with a district to be able to offer courses to the state. And again, that natural disincentive meant that a lot of good course providers didn't have that access, whereas now they can go directly to the agency and submit courses, whether it's a nonprofit, for-profit. MIT or Stanford couldn't come to Texas if they weren't in partnership with a school district.
Nikki?
Okay, now I have a 3-part question instead of a 2-part question. So the first was actually about this teacher licensure thing, because I don't know if you guys realize that, but that is the huge barrier to actually quality providers being able to work in your states or in other states that are considering it. So some sort of reciprocity, some sort of something that allows a provider not to have licensed teachers in every single state for the 3 kids that might want to take that online physics course. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. The second is about pricing, because obviously a piece of per pupil funding follows into these providers, and I suspect each state has a slightly different way of calculating that. And then the final one is the put on your fortune teller hat. Is this a trend, or are we kind of looking at the pool of states that have done this, and do we think that that's going to grow or not?
So Mickey, in Texas, as part of our legislation, we definitely attacked the reciprocity. So it now allows the agency to enter into reciprocity agreements with other states. And John has done a great job at trying to engage some folks in the agency to introduce them. SREB's doing some great programs, whether it's high-quality CTE partnerships and Texas teacher licensure. On pricing. So this session, we will advocate we have an arbitrary cap of $400 per semester. Louisiana goes up to, can go up to $1,200, just depending on the.
Welding costs more, so we pay what a welding course costs.
Right. So we're hoping to attack that this legislative session as well.
On the, so teacher licensure, Louisiana has reciprocity. So I'm gonna go off the sort of the message machine here for a second, but I would love to see a enhanced view of what it means to be a teacher per that question. I mean, I think in what you're seeing in the blended learning environments that are popping up all over the country is lots of team teaching environments where one person's a subject matter expert, someone else is really good at working one-on-one with students, someone else is a data wonk, right? And so those people won't necessarily fit under traditional licensure schemes. And so my take would be, and this is unlikely to happen, but if you are holding providers for real account with an objective assessment, I don't care what the staffing model looks like as long as you're getting students to real mastery, right? And so I'd love to see an opening up of what it means to be a teacher in those environments, provided we have that accountability on it. The accountability has to come first. On the pricing, I'd love to see a more market-based approach to this ultimately, where providers could come in with what they charge. If you maybe came below a certain allotment, because there are caps and things of that nature, but maybe you could contribute successful savings into an education savings account or a 529 plan for students to make it more attractive or something like that. I'd love to see some creativity there. And then the third thing is in terms of trend, it's hard to say. I think a few more states will move on this. I think the bigger trend is going to be that it causes districts to start innovating in their own right, and you won't necessarily see lots of students doing huge enrollments through these programs, except in those places they truly don't have an option. But the big thing will be that it causes districts to create more blended learning programs in their own right. And then I think the big question for us is how do we get the good accountability metrics that we can write into state law to apply in those district examples as well. And so maybe the state providing contract language around performance-based contracting or tools in the toolkit, sort of like Jamey has done in Michigan, I think is going to be a really critical piece of this.
I would just add on the trend question, right now all of the course access programs that exist are self-contained within an individual state. And clearly when kids go off to college, they have the ability to go anywhere. And I think that at some point down the road, we're going to start to see choice at a national level.
And I was going to speak to trends just in general. So in Minnesota, when I talk about online learning and the programs, I'm only talking about the tip of the iceberg, because schools that are just delivering a few online courses to their students don't have to report their numbers to the state. Schools that are doing digital learning, flipped classrooms, all of those kinds of things, we don't have any way to collect that information. The only numbers really that we have are for those folks, those providers, those public entities that decide they want to be approved. And so they come in and we can see their numbers. And like I said, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think if there were something that maybe could be done to figure out how to capture some of the things that are happening across Minnesota's schools, I think we'd see a lot of trends. And when I think about teacher licensure too, it's not just about a licensed teacher and an approved program course, but it's also about teacher pre-service programs, and are they delivering the kinds of content and skills that teachers are going to need to teach in the classrooms of today, because that's changing dramatically.
Moderator's prerogative, so I get to weigh in too. Maybe three thoughts. One, I think teacher licensure, that's always been a very blunt instrument as a proxy to guard against risk for quality. right? And if you have a pay-for-success system the way Michael was describing, then teacher licensure becomes slightly less important. So there's ways, I think, that as you're developing these policies in states to think about sort of the dials and levers. That again, if you're paying for only success, then you can be a little bit more flexible in terms of who you're allowing in as a provider, as a teacher, and so forth. Second, on the funding, I can't agree too with because this is one mistake we see a lot of states making, is that they just arbitrarily pick a number and say this is how much we're going to pay for a course or for a semester, and it really is like it's like a monkey throwing a dart at the wall. Like it's not, there's not rigorous. And what we're seeing from some of the Louisiana and some of the other data is that the pricing can vary. So if you set a price arbitrarily, you're overpaying a lot of providers, and you're probably shutting out a whole bunch of not just other providers, but models, because a blended learning solution may cost more than just a pure online. A face-to-face solution may cost slightly more than just an online or a blended. So you want a lot of competition, not just on quality, but also along the pricing there too. And then lastly, I actually think this is a trend that we're going to see a lot of governors and legislators pick up over. And the reason, and I think you could see this in just the conversation, is because this isn't just about technology, right? This becomes a really interesting sandbox for any other type of reform that you want to advance as a lawmaker. If you're really interested in every single kid having AP, course access is the way to do it. If you're interested in STEM, course access is the way to do it. If you're interested in helping to incentivize certain blended learning models, course access is the way to do it. The learning accounts that Michael was just talking about, here's another way to sort of try that out before rolling it out across the state. So I think this is a really great way for states to try out a lot of other innovation in a nicely neat, innovative sort of box.
Hi, Dale Frost, Arizona Governor's Office. Our education savings accounts are kind of allowing that to happen, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I'm really interested in competency-based education. Michael, I'd love to hear you talk a little more about New Hampshire's model. Is it just their one school, and how does the data system process work? And then I'm also curious about these portals. Do you guys say which courses are competency-based, and you can move at your own pace and take the assessment at your own pace? Can you filter by that? Are there ways so students interested in that can go right to those courses?
Great set of questions. On the New Hampshire question, it's this one provider that has set up this arrangement themselves. It's not a state regulation. They basically hold the funds in escrow, and then New Hampshire has unbelievable competency-based pathways allowed, but not mandated in any funding. With any funding behind it or teeth behind a funding policy change. So it's really this school looked at Florida Virtual School, I think, and said, let's try this and set it up. So just one thing, you're relying on the fact that it's a good provider there, right? That's not necessarily what you would open up to a menu of providers. You'd want to think more carefully about a state systematic approach.
Sure, go ahead.
In Minnesota, the only requirement is that they put out the course descriptions for the online learning courses that they're going to take. So if you were to go to look us up, what you would see is a list of all the courses. Those courses would be connected to providers, and it would be just the description. One of the things that's beginning to happen with the approval process lately, though, is that some schools are deciding to make their syllabus completely transparent. So we do have some providers that if you were to go to their websites, you could click, you could see the complete syllabus, how it aligns to the standards, what the tests are, what the grading process is. It's all very, very open. They're not required to do that, but it's great when they do.
Thank you.
You've talked a lot about course-specific issues regarding virtual education. What I'd like to hear is something about virtual charters. That's an issue that's coming up more and more. I understand there's been some very unfortunate experiences in some states, but if we are looking down the road at access, which is access for everybody, virtual charters represent an opportunity. We are going to look at them in North Carolina, but we're hesitant and anxious to hear what should be on our mind as we test or pilot test a couple of those.
I'm not sure if this should be on your mind, but I can share with you how Minnesota looks at this. The first thing is that they have to become a charter. So once they become a charter school and they're in business, they can submit a letter of intent to the department, and they can say that that is their intention to be an online charter. And so it's a process that really can't be as in tandem as we would like it to be, but we do coordinate and talk and communicate with each other about that process. And we do have at least 6 charter schools that are online schools on our approved list.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that North Carolina is getting closer to offering that public school option to families. I think you certainly need to keep high quality and accountability measures in mind, but also when considering accountability, keep in mind that for so many students who enter into full-time online learning, it's actually the school of last resort for that student when other options have failed. And so looking at educational growth of that student for the time that they've been in the school when you're measuring student achievement, I think is important as well.
Great, thanks. We could talk separately too offline since charters are different. And I think we're,
I'm going to play a little bit of bad cop. We've got a handful of minutes left and would love for each of you to get a chance. So if you could please.
last 4 questions.
Yes.
All right, Holly and then Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Holly Sagas, Florida Virtual School. So my question is, how do we encourage a traditional school district currently funded on inputs to take the risk and encourage students to take courses funded on outputs?
We're out of time for questions. No, go ahead. I'm just kidding, actually.
No, do you want to get all the questions out, or? Okay, we can go
Yeah,
quickly.
we'll do this.
Okay, so honestly, I think encouraging traditional districts to move to performance-based funding, their business models, and this is from an innovation perspective, are just not set up for this. The processes and priorities with the fixed costs that they have and the ways that they have budgeted and seat time has run through them, it's just not going to happen. And so I think it's an encouragement and fight that we shouldn't be thinking about until we have a huge critical mass that has moved to a competency-based world in these blended and online environments, and then we can have that conversation. I think if we're trying to have that conversation right now, and districts trying to get them to switch their funding model, we're pushing up, we're pushing a boulder up a really steep hill that's just not worth it, in my opinion.
Lindsay Burke, Heritage Foundation. A few months ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the $4 million teacher who's in South Korea. He was so popular, his tutoring was so popular, he was able to earn that much in a year. So thinking about what you said, John, and where all the SalCons and the districts, and Jamey working off of some of your remarks, do you see 10 years from now a point where a teacher could actually receive a proportion of the funding to pocket himself based on the number of students that enroll in his excellent course that he puts online, statewide or nationwide?
I think it's completely within the realm of possibility, yes.
And just the only thing I'd add, just having been in Korea for a month studying the education system there, is it's important to remember those were private dollars, right? And there's a whole host of reasons, and Korea has a very rock star mentality around teachers, but not around the course quality itself, which is like a really interesting fissure, because the courses that they were paying a lot of money for were actually pretty garbage. And so, but the cult of the person is like really important in that society. So I think Jamie's right. We're going to absolutely start to see teachers be able to command some of this, but I think we want to be careful in the analogies between the two.
Nancy?
Nancy Danhoff, Michigan. Jamie and I have talked about this often, but I'm wondering how the rest of you see, once you get these systems in place in your state, how do you see access truly for every student when many of our students don't have access to the internet?
Part of our legislation last session was to mandate that the agency do a study of broadband network access. And I know that through Digital Learning Now, there's some other organizations that will do that at the state level that will come in and help fund that, because it's such an important piece. We don't have that information back quite yet, but I hope that it helps inform us as we go into the next legislative session as the results are published. But it's critical.
Go
That's important in our state, too. When I first landed at the department, one of the first things that I had to respond to was a legislator, an angry parent had contacted him about the online program. They lived in an area of the state where there isn't good connectivity, and they were using satellite, and they had the lowest priced satellite, which meant that it's just like getting on the interstate at a certain time. They're going to get bumped off, and typically the students are going on to do their work about the same time everybody else is going online. So one of the things then that we built into the approval process is a question to providers about how they're going to work with and help parents understand this. So in our state, they have to give them information about tax credits for technology, and they have to discuss internet and connectivity and talk about what they're going to do to help parents and students understand what's available in their region and to have a plan on how they're going to participate in that online environment.
Just 3 very quick points. One is that there's an organization that Giselle funds and is a partner to all of us, Education Superhighway, that will come in and help do state audits and help districts out with this. Second, there's been a massive round of E-rate reforms, including a proposal this week that will go to vote next month to inject about another $1.5 billion into the fund. So roughly about $4 billion going out to help with broadband and Wi-Fi. The challenge is that it's only in schools. And this is, I think, probably where we need the third round of E-rate reform, which is how do we make sure that the broadband access follows with mobile and then also to the home, because that's so much where these courses aren't being accessed necessarily on a campus, but off campus, and so we need that as well. Last question.
Hey, thank you. I'll try to keep it brief. Randy DeHuff from Colorado. And when I first heard about this in Utah, I was out there when they were passing it and following that. It really struck me as, hey, this could be the next major disruptive innovation out there. And yet, as I listen to you, I'm extremely discouraged about how the system is co-opting that over teacher licensure, over you've got to be a state provider, over all these rules and regulations that say you've got to do it our way so that we can still control it. And I think the trend is going to be keep pushing against those bars, but how do we get there? And I guess I'll address it to Michael, because right now it's not going there.
Yeah, so couple quick thoughts. One is, I think starting off, we haven't talked about the funding so much in this conversation, but I think staging the funding so that if you can start with a line item appropriation rather than taking dollars directly from districts, you have more autonomy there to carve out the program, the ideal program, because there'll be fewer interests that are going to get quote unquote hurt by this passage. So you allow yourself to get the ideal more than if you go right to a funding model that moves this direction. I think as it scales then, you can change that funding model, and you see the Florida success story, I think, out of that, right? So second thing, I also think disruption is fundamentally game theory. Like, that's what disruptive innovation is. It just predicts who's going to make what moves, right? And therefore you can predict what the success will be, or not. And I think very clearly, because of the way districts budget today, because they don't do a real activity-based budgeting, but in sort of based on last year's budget, we just add X percent to all of our categoricals, and they don't have this autonomy because of the way regulation works at the local, state, federal levels. It's hard for them to see any dollars flowing out as a win, even if it's just $500, right? And so getting around that is one way to do that, right? To change the capacity there and to free up the regulations that constrain inputs to give more latitude in spending. Another way to do it, if we don't do that, the reality is districts are going to be threatened by this, I think, and put it back in the box. But I think you're going to see the innovation then occur from the districts. So I think the challenge to us is how do we capture what's going on there, just reality, right? And move that into the plane that Holly alluded to, where we actually start to move these movements. And this maybe is the better way to answer your question from before, is how do we move the innovation into these zones of competency-based and performance-based funding where they actually can create a business model from scratch. That's, I think, the interesting enticement that we ought to be thinking about, and no one solved that.
And I also think, quick point, Texas is very fortunate to have an organization like TR that is totally focused on what's best for the students and advocating student-centric policies. And while I didn't form the organization, totally honored to lead it. And states need that in a way to keep legislators accountable, especially as superintendents lean on them with some of these policy-making decisions. And so to the extent that you can have advocacy organizations helping you in North Carolina make these arguments, it'll make it a bit easier in the legislative process. It was a game changer in Texas this last session, I believe.
Great. 3 quick things, and then we will let y'all head out towards lunch. First of all, thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate all the insight today.